Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. So this is part 2 of our look at Napoleon's heavy cavalry of the Imperial Guard. And we're going to jump straight in with the Gendarme d'Elite. They're a bit of an odd one when it comes to the perspective of wargaming, because as the name suggests, they were a very early military police unit. In times of peace, their role was to protect official residences and palaces, and provide security for important figures such as ambassadors or princes, things like that. In times of war, however, their role was to protect the imperial headquarters and to escort prisoners, and occasionally to enforce the law and limit civil disorder in conquered cities. To be honest, it's pretty much what you would expect from military police today. The Gendarmes d'Elite were formed in 1801 by Napoleon and formed part of his consular guard. After escorting the first consul to Notre Dame in December 1804 and escorting the Emperor out again, the consular guard became the Imperial Guard, and with it, the Gendarmes d'Elite. It was originally made up of one squadron, but by 1804 that had been expanded to a full mixed regiment of 2 mounted squadrons and 2 infantry companies, being a unit of 632 men altogether. After the Austerlitz campaign, the infantry companies were dropped, and only the 456 cavalrymen remained, so that's still quite a few. The minimum height for a gendarme was 1.76 metres, which is 5'9", and they certainly dressed to impress. They wore a uniform similar to the Grenadier à Cheval, with bearskin, but the gendarme version had a peak. Later, for the Battle of Waterloo, they were issued helmets. They were quite different from the ones normally worn by French helmeted troops like the cuirassiers or the dragoons. They're what I call firemen's helmets. They had a very tall peak on them with a black horsehair crest. As far as I know, they're very similar to the engineers of the Guard ones. I'm sure there are differences, and I'm sure someone out there can tell me the exact designation of those helmets. But that's what they remind me of anyway. But, you know, at Waterloo it was a very hastily put together army. Not all of them had helmets. Some of them would have worn their bearskins. Some of them would have just worn the bonnet de police, which is like the field cap thing that they wear. And obviously some of them would have had the new helmets as well. As with all military police, they were not particularly well liked by the soldiery. Due to their role, they were not really committed to combat either. As I said, they would be protecting prisoners or protecting their headquarters and things like that. And due to their unlikeliness to actually do any fighting, they were nicknamed the Immortals by the troops, and that's not a compliment. That's saying that, you know, they never get in a position where they're likely to be killed. But that's a little unfair. They were in situations where they were in danger, I guess you could say. Probably not as much as that infantryman at the front of that column marching towards the line of British, but, you know, it's all relative, isn't it, I guess. And for an example of that, at the Battle of Aspern-Essling, they guarded the access to the bridge from Lobau Island, which brought the reinforcements through, and they only let the most severely wounded back onto the island. Previously to that as well, in 1808, 56 of them had been caught up in La Salle's great charge at Medina de Rio Seco, and for more details on the craziness of that charge, you can check out the La Salle video in our Napoleonic Figures series. The Gendarmes d'Elite also fought at the Battle of Borodino, and they covered the French retreat at the Battle of Berezina. Despite the losses endured during the Russian campaign, the gendarmes also fought during the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, and in a notable episode, General Fournier Saint-Louvazet was sent to Mayence prison by Napoleon for his defeatist attitude following the battle. En route to the prison, his carriage was escorted by a detachment of gendarmes, and it was attacked by a group of Russian Cossacks. A gendarme was killed, and the general, grabbing the sword of the dead man, took the reins of the carriage and with the help of the remaining gendarmes routed the Cossacks. He then returned to his seat and stated, "Go on to Mayence." So that's a great skirmish game potential if ever I've seen one. As the Allies tightened their grip on France's throat in 1814, the Immortals had their name truly put to the test.
But apparently has rules for the gendarmes, and overall, yeah, I think they're pretty good.
The invasion of
They're
France
basically a tiny unit of Grenadier à Cheval. I think realistically, especially for the 100 Days campaign, I'd probably just mix them in with the Grenadiers. Just stick 3 or 4 figures in with the Grenadier à Cheval and just have them as one medium or maybe even large unit. But to be honest, I don't think it hugely matters either way. I think that if they're on the battlefield, you're kind of using the rule of cool anyway, so I don't think it hugely matters.
All of which brings us to the reason why you're here. One of my favourite units of the Napoleonic Wars, the gods, the Grenadier à Cheval de la Garde Impériale, the Grenadier à Cheval. Now these were the senior cavalry regiment of the Imperial Guard. There were 6 squadrons in all. 4 of them were classed as Old Guard. They rode black horses. And 2 of them were classed as Young Guard, and they would ride chestnut horses. So that allows a bit of variation in your units. And as I said earlier in the video, if you're using the Gendarme d'Elite, certainly in 1815, then you could also add them in as well. So you can have quite a varied unit of Grenadier à Cheval there. The concept of a mounted elite bodyguard went back in France at least as far as Charlemagne, but in the more recent times it was rediscovered, I guess you could say, or reappointed with the Maison de Roy, the elite guard of the Sun King Louis XIV. Now those guys would wear bearskins, which it was due to their defeat by the Scots Greys at Ramillies that the Scots Greys wore bearskins as well. It was a battle honour for their defeat of the household cavalry of the French king. But after the revolution, a unit of horse grenadiers was raised as part of the consular guard, and the first taste of battle for this newly formed unit took place in the War of the Second Coalition at Marengo. As first consul, Napoleon was losing the battle against the Austrians. Louis Desailles' French division appeared on the field of battle, and as Desailles' men charged, 2 separate cavalry charges helped change the course of the battle, and I guess one, could quite say of history as well. One of them was led by one of our upcoming Napoleonic figures, so there's a bit of a spoiler here, Francois Kellerman, and he deployed his brigade on the Austrian right before charging in and just overrunning everything in his way. On the Austrian left, Bezier organised a massive charge with the whole consular guard cavalry, and he increased the rout and panic of the enemy troops. I think it's safe to say that it was Kellerman's charge that broke the Austrians in the first place, but it was the charge of the Guard cavalry under Bezier that really drove the point home. Bezier received high praise for his actions from the first consul, who said to his general, quote, "Under your command the Guard covered itself with glory. It could not have performed better under the given circumstances." End quote. Didn't do Bezier a great amount of good though, because just over a month after the battle, the command of the regiment was taken over by Colonel Michel Ordonez, although, Bezier was promoted, so it wasn't maybe the worst thing in the world for him. With the ascension of Napoleon from Consul Bonaparte to Emperor Bonaparte in 1804, the Consular Guard became the Imperial Guard, and the Grenadier à Cheval got their final title. Exactly 1 year later, in 1805, they would see action again on the field of Austerlitz. The plan to split the Austro-Russian army was going brilliantly well, until the very solid Russian Imperial Guard was sent into the fray, crushing yet another of our future Napoleonic figures, General Van Damme and his division, around Stary Vinohrady, the old vineyards. The Russian Imperial Guard were in danger of breaking through the French lines, and so it was time for Napoleon to commit his cavalry reserves. 4 squadrons, totaling 423 men of the Chasseurs à Cheval and the Mameluke Regiment, and 4 squadrons of 706 men of the Grenadier à Cheval Regiment, with a battery of Guard horse artillery in support, were sent in. The Grenadiers charged vigorously, with a battle cry, "Let the ladies of St. Petersburg weep," and clashed with the Russian Chevalier Guard Regiment. After a short melee, the Horse Grenadiers broke their opponents, inflicting heavy casualties, and capturing over 200 men. Their commander, Prince Repnin, with his general staff, as well as 27 pieces of artillery, with the loss of just 2 killed and 22 wounded, among which 6 officers were wounded. The Austrians and Russians were defeated, but the latter weren't out of the fight. Joining with a newly belligerent Prussia, the war moved east, and with it the Imperial Guard. In 1806, the colonel of the Grenadier à Cheval, General Ordonez, retired from active duty, being replaced by General Walter. Like most Guard units, they had an unusual rank structure, being commanded by a general of division, who had the title of Colonel Commander, assisted by a Brigadier General, who had the title of Colonel Major, also called Major en Premier, or the First Major, and he himself was assisted by a general, or maybe a colonel, with the title of Major en Second, Second Major. So a little bit different from the regular cavalry there. Certainly, as befitting their guard status, they were commanded by troops
higher than one would normally expect for that level of formation. Due to his seniority, Walther also was second in command of the entire Guard cavalry and exercised this command whenever Marshal Bezier was not available for service. The speed of the 1806 thrashing of Prussia meant that the regiment didn't see any action in that campaign, but the Russians still didn't give up, so the war now moved into a wintry Poland. Campaigning conditions were dreadful, carried out during what the Russians call the Rasputitsa, with roads being nothing more than slimy mud, and there being a terrible scarcity of food. The first major engagement of the two armies occurred in the deep snow of Eylau. Here the Grande Armee gave battle despite being seriously outnumbered, and with the expected reinforcements failing to materialise, Napoleon's position was looking increasingly perilous. Early in the battle, the Russian great batteries were pouring fire into the French lines, 60 of which were firing at the Grenadier Cheval. Now, I'm not sure that they were particularly firing at the Grenadier Cheval, or those were like the wide and the long shots that were pounding the French advancing infantry. As the shot and shell flew overhead, the natural instincts of the men took over, and they ducked. Colonel Lepic, standing his horse alone out front, noticed this, and furiously shouted, "Heads up, by God! Those are bullets, not turds!" And here we really see the ideology of the Grenadier Cheval. It wasn't the fact that they were ducking. And here we really see the ideology of the Grenadier Cheval and of the First Empire in general. That shame was worse than death. You would rather be hit with a cannonball than a turd. At one point, and stop me if you've heard this story before, the Russian foot guard nearly broke through the French lines, and in this battle they nearly captured the Emperor himself. Only fierce hand-to-hand fighting between Russian and French Imperial Guards through the cemetery saved his position, and that's for me, that is one of the most visually excellent things in the Napoleonic Wars. You've got waist-deep snow, you've got an old crumbling churchyard, and you've got the old guard bayonet dueling the Russian Imperial Guard in there. It does not get any more cool than that, as far as I'm concerned. Now the person of the Emperor was saved. They could turn their attentions to trying to save the French position. Napoleon ordered Marshal Murat to launch the entire reserve cavalry into a massive charge. At first, Murat led forward 2 dragoon and 1 cuirassier division, and as these men pierced the Russian lines and carried on beyond, they found themselves surrounded and isolated in the midst of the enemy army. So in order to extricate them, Napoleon ordered Marshal Bezier to help the stranded cavalry reserve, and thus a second great cavalry charge ensued, this time spearheaded by the Chasseurs à Cheval of the Guard, and followed by the heavy cavalry of the 5th Cuirassiers and the Grenadier à Cheval. Commanding the Horse Grenadiers was Colonel Lepic, who personally led 2 squadrons of the regiment as they stormed through the 1st and 2nd Russian lines, stopping only in front of the enemy reserve. As a handful of Horse Grenadiers arrived in front of this 3rd enemy line, they were all but surrounded, and the Russians at once demanded that they surrender. Lepic defiantly retorted, "Have a look at my men, and tell me if they look like ones who want to surrender." He immediately ordered a charge, hacking his way back to his own lines. The regiment lost 4 officers dead and 14 officers wounded, as well as a large number of troopers. But the charge of the Guard cavalry did allow their fellow reserve cavalry to break their own encirclement and get back to the original positions. The French would go on to draw the bloody Battle of Eylau later that evening. There's an incident reported in the great book Napoleon's Polish Gamble, where a Russian general was duelling with a grenadier when the latter lost his sword. Lacking a weapon, the Frenchman used his mailed fist to punch the general in the chest with such force that it broke several of his ribs. It would put him out of action for the rest of the campaign, so clearly even an unarmed horse grenadier could be very bad for your health. This seems like the perfect time to talk about the men that made up the Grenadier à Cheval. They were the epitome of big men on big horses, being a minimum of 5'10" tall to qualify, which is pretty tall back then, with 4 years of service and 2 campaigns under their belts. Again, they also must have been nominated for bravery, so making a large number of them members of the Légion d'honneur. The height restriction later dropped to 5'8", but they then increased the required service to 10 years and a minimum of 4 campaigns. One incident in 1809, recounted by James Arnold, shows a selection which, while quite unusual, shows the type of men that were looked for to join the Grenadier à Cheval. Quote, "The 3rd Cuirassier Division passed in review at the Schönbrunn. As was his custom when honouring gallant units, Napoleon stood before the 8th Cuirassier Regiment and asked who was the unit's bravest trooper. The colonel replied that the entire regiment was brave. The emperor directed his question to the troopers, and when they answered "Mio," when that worthy stepped forward, Napoleon, exhibiting the formidable memory that so delighted his grognards, or, as I've added here, his deft political touch, he inquired if they had not already met. "Yes," replied Mio, "at Healdsburg." Napoleon awarded him with a cherished cross and would later promote him into the Imperial Guard Horse Grenadiers. Mio would later be killed in 1813. The men only rode large black horses, although the 2 squadrons of the Young Guard would ride chestnuts, and the trumpeters would ride white horses. Speaking of white and black, the Grenadiers also wore black bearskins, almost the same as the chasseurs of the Guard, so they didn't have the front plate that the Grenadiers had, but they did have all the white cords that the chasseurs only had on their dress bearskins. The trumpeters, however, I've seen them depicted as wearing white bearskins. I've also seen them as wearing black bearskins. I don't think it really matters. I've done mine white because I think it looks cool and makes him stand out, but it's entirely up to you. They also wore a much paler blue on their uniform. They were paid as Old Guard and regarded as the elite of the elite, called the gods by the rest of the army, and not mockingly as the Gendarmes were. They were also afforded other privileges, being higher than the equivalent rank of the line, and being honoured by them, about which I'm sure the line wasn't massively impressed, I'll be honest. One decree reading, "When the guard meets the line en route, the latter shall form in line of battle and port arms or present sabres. Flags and standards shall be dipped. Colonels and commanders shall exchange salutes." With the situation in Eastern Europe now tidily sewn up by the Treaty of Tilsit, Napoleon set his eyes on sunnier climes, and in 1808 both he and the Grenadier Cheval, together with 2 newly created Young Guard infantry regiments and some Guard artillery, were sent as part of Bézier's Second Corps to the Army of Spain. During the Madrid uprising we talked about in the Imperial Guard light cavalry video, their first surgeon, Gautier, was wounded. They then campaigned in the northwest of the country, where on July the 14th, Béziers, with around 14,000 men, faced 2 massed Spanish corps, totalling about 22,000, not far away from Valladolid. A few squadrons of the regiment saw brief but decisive action in the ensuing Battle of Medina del Rio Seco, as they came up in support of General Merle's infantry attack, which repulsed the Spanish onto Medina and beyond, winning the battle. Despite the Grenadier Cheval not taking part in any of the major battles, they did not emerge unscathed. In The Anatomy of Glory, the writer mentions an incident where, quote, "A squadron of horse grenadiers tethered their horses in the garden of a monastery, and were lured by an urchin to come and quench his thirst. One trooper did not return. A grenadier who went in search of him also disappeared. So men of their troop returning from a foraging detail conducted an investigation, sabres in hand. They found the child, followed him, and discovered their 2 comrades with their heads cut off. They arrested 8 monks and threw them all out of a window." Their lack of combat fighting in Spain certainly wasn't down to their army commander, the wily Marshal Massena. Napoleon had made an error in following the French retreat from Lisbon on May the 5th, 1811, and found himself in the awkward position at the Battle of Fuentes de Onoro. Massena needed Bézier's entire army corps if he was to thoroughly beat the Anglo-Portuguese, but Béziers brought only symbolic reinforcements, a few squadrons of horse dragoons and grenadiers, 800 men in all, under the command of General Lepic. Despite the setback, Massena exploited a weakness on Wellington's right, and soon it seemed like the Anglo-Portuguese would be crushed. Time was of the essence, and Massena promptly sent his young aide-de-camp, Charles Oudinot, to find Lepic and the Guard cavalry, with orders to charge immediately. But Oudinot was soon back to his commander, saying that he was not able to fetch the Guard cavalry because Lepic only recognised Béziers as commander, and that he would not draw his sword without Béziers' order. The general was nowhere to be found, allowing Wellington's army to escape intact. It was not the only time that their arrogance would cost the French dearly. In the middle of their Spanish adventures, the Grenadier Cheval had been recalled to Napoleon's side during his invasion of Austria. They were present at the Battle of Aspern-Essling, and under intense fire from the numerous Austrian artillery, they saw the struggle of their army to contain a vastly superior opponent, superior in numbers at least. When Napoleon himself had his boot torn off by a canister ball, General Frederic Henri Walther, commander of the Guard cavalry, threatened the Emperor that he would have his grenadiers taken behind the lines by force if he refused to do so willingly. The latter complied and had to order a general retreat of the army to the Danube island of Lobau. 6 weeks later, however, Napoleon crossed the Danube again, this time managing to bring his full army onto the Marchfeld plain and onto the field of Wagram. The first day would see the Grenadier Cheval in reserve, but on the second day, July the 6th, 1809, The Grenadiers, with the rest of the Guard cavalry, were assigned to support General Jacques Macdonald's massive attack column. After an initial success, Macdonald saw a rare opportunity to rout the disorderly troops before him, and to that effect he requested a charge from General Etienne de Nansouty's cavalry reserve, inviting all of the cavalry commanders in the sector to do the same. The Guard cavalry, however, did not move, and the opportunity came to nothing. A furious Macdonald confronted Walther after the battle over the latter's inaction, at which Walther explained that neither his commander, Marshal Beziers, nor the Emperor had given any orders for a charge, and that the Guard could not act without direct orders from one of the two. Macdonald's attempts to explain that a charge would have been decisive fell on deaf ears, as Walther at once saluted and left. As with pretty much everything French-related on this channel, 1812 saw a massive sea change and a huge reformation of the French army. As a part of the 3rd Brigade of the Guard Cavalry, Grenadier à Cheval numbered 1,166 men spread between 5 squadrons. The first part of the invasion of Russia from June to September was nothing more than a long march for the Guard, in which it was never committed to battle. It was able to arrive on the field of Borodino at full strength. Despite the various insistent demands of the French field commanders, including a furious Ney, Napoleon refused to commit the Guard to battle so far away from Paris. During the Great Fire of Moscow, alongside the Gendarmes d'Elite, the Grenadiers à Cheval were used to police the city and guarded the Kremlin due to their reputation of discipline and high moral standards. By mid-October, the entire Grande Armee began to move out of the ruined city, and the retreat towards Poland would offer only secondary actions to the Grenadier à Cheval, with the mission of ensuring the safety of the Imperial headquarters. Interestingly, being provided with the largest and best horses meant that the Grenadier à Cheval suffered more harshly than many of the other branches of the cavalry. The daily ration for their horses was 10 pounds of hay, 15 pounds of straw, and 2/3 of a bushel of oats, or 1/3 of bran each. And that level of supply was impossible to maintain during the retreat. In his book on Stalingrad, Anthony Beevor provides accounts that the largest men were the most affected by starvation and adverse conditions, and it was the smaller, wiry guys who managed to survive. So it was with Napoleonic men and horses. The Grenadier à Cheval were the largest of the large men, but even so, an emaciated, struggling squadron of grenadiers was enough to see off marauding Cossacks. Chalapowski writes, "There then appeared the horse grenadiers in line formation. This line of black horses, its tall riders also in black bearskins, so impressed the Cossacks that they disappeared into the forest." All that said, the skirmishes, the cold and the deprivations during the retreat took their toll on the regiment, and by the time of the Battle of Berezina, the combined Grenadier à Cheval and Chasseurs à Cheval were only able to field 500 combat-worthy men on horseback, plus several hundred dismounted. Despite this, there is evidence that morale remained good throughout. The regiment took some time to reform during 1813 and would only go back into action in April. Napoleon reviewed them at Erfurt on April the 27th, and only 3 days later the Grenadier à Cheval received news of the death of their beloved leader, Marshal Jean-Baptiste Beziers, who had been killed in action by a stray Russian cannonball next to the village of Ripac. The regiment saw brief action at the Battle of Dresden, I was involved in supporting the Foot Guards take the village of Rudnitz during the Battle of Leipzig in late October. The final major engagement of that year would come at the end of October at the Battle of Hanau, as the Austro-Bavarians and Karl Philipp von Red were trying to block the retreat of the Grande Armee towards France. Napoleon was forced to commit his elite troops, personally haranguing the Grenadier à Cheval as they were preparing to go into action. The entire Guard cavalry charged by squadron in column and broke numerous enemy cavalry, following it for several hundred metres. During this battle, the Colonel Major of the regiment, General Louis-Marie Lavesque, received 6 sabre cuts to the shoulder and arm, and Captain Adjutant Major Gwindley, famous for killing Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia at the Battle of Saalfeld 7 years earlier, was killed in action. Another blow was dealt to the morale of the regiment on November the 24th, when the regiment's Commander-in-Chief, General of Division Frederic Henri Walther, died suddenly from exhaustion and illness. He was replaced on December the 1st by the 45-year-old General of Division Claude Etienne Gouault, with the Senior General of Division Etienne Marie-Antoine Champion de Nansouty taking over general command of the Guard Cavalry. The following year, war continued on French soil and began very badly, with the French army outnumbered and in very poor shape. The Guard Cavalry under Nansouty was thus called into action more often than ever, combating valiantly and often playing an instrumental role in Napoleon's attempts to frustrate the coalition's plans. Together with other regiments of the Guard, the Grenadier à Cheval fought against overwhelming enemy numbers at La Rothière and 9 days later broke several Russian infantry squares from General Zakhar Olsufiev's force. At the Battle of Montmirail, the Grenadier à Cheval annihilated 2 Russian brigades, and at the Battle of Chateau Thierry successfully charged coalition artillery batteries, 2 days later helping rout Blucher's army at the Battle of Vauchamp. They were then involved in several actions, including major ones at Rheims and Couronne, where they routed several enemy squares. During this battle, the commander of the Grenadiers, General Lavesque de la Ferrière, was wounded by a bullet and had a leg torn off, and also lost one of his best officers, Captain Kister. Their last action of the campaign was fought at Mairie-sur-Seine, where they captured a team of enemy pontooniers from the Army of Bohemia. Still, the unwavering faith they had in the Emperor continued. In March 1814, a major was so badly wounded when a foot was blown away by a Russian cannonball at Crayonne that the surgeon was left with no other option but to amputate. As he did so, the man, quote, bore with great courage and called out "Vive l'Empereur" before losing consciousness. After Napoleon's abdication and the Bourbon Restoration, the Grenadier à Cheval were ordered to Blois by Royal Ordnance and were to be reorganised into a Corps of Royal Cuirassiers of France. Complement was set by the 21st of June Ordnance, and provided that the corps was to be 52 officers and 602 men strong, divided into 2 company-strength squadrons. However, with Napoleon's return to power in late March 1815, the Grenadier à Cheval regained their former organisation and title. But perhaps mirroring the Emperor himself, they weren't quite at the standard they once were. Mark Adkin wrote, "These once magnificent horsemen had, like much of the army, lost their shine. There was a shabbiness, a lack of uniformity. Most wore blue single-breasted undress coats. Some had their grubby off-white cloaks on. Some had them rolled across their shoulder, others in front of the saddle. While most had bearskins, few were ornamented. The remainder wore an assortment of hats or forage caps." Henry Lecoq describes the fur caps or their bearskins as looking, quote, rather mangy. During the 100 Days, the Grenadiers à Cheval formed the Guard Heavy Cavalry Division alongside the Imperial Guard Dragoons, so the Emperor's Dragoons. Their only engagement took place at the Battle of Waterloo, and the charges of the Grenadiers were impetuous, but losses were heavy. They lost Major Jean-Baptiste Auguste Marie Jamin, killed by British canister shot near a square, 2 lieutenants, Tuford and Moreau, and 16 other officers wounded. They were not destroyed, though, as Captain Barton of the British 12th Light Dragoons wrote, quote, "The Horse Grenadiers appeared to take but little notice of our advance. When opposite their flank, they fired a few pistol or carbine shots. We were being too weak to make an impression on them. They literally walked from the field in a most majestic manner." Waterloo was to be the last engagement of this legendary unit, the very symbol of the Grande Armee, and they were disbanded by the Bourbons after their second restoration in late 1815. So with that, we reach the end of the history of this most august formation. We'll look at their rules for the tabletop. Now, they've got rules in both Albion Triumphant Volume 2 for their appearance at Waterloo, and in Clash of Eagles as well. And they are the best cavalry in the French army, as befits their status. I think overall it's a good representation of the gods, but I think there's room for a couple of changes. First of all, the negative ones. I would say that they can never benefit from a C&C reroll unless their C&C for the whole army is Napoleon himself or Marshal Bezier. So that's to represent the times where they were ordered to charge and they were like, well, you're not the boss, so no, I don't think we will be. In the late war, as we saw, they charged and broke a number of squares, so perhaps a mechanic that lets them do that might be useful. Something like letting them charge disordered squares, or when they charge a square automatically becomes disordered. That might be a little too powerful, but something like that. Now, one thing that I would be tempted to say is that these guys were huge men on huge black horses, and the intimidation that they had on the enemy was a huge part of them as well. We saw the Cossacks didn't even bother, and the British Light Dragoons also sort of fired a couple of shots at them and then said, nah, we're alright, thanks. I would -1 from the enemy's morale saves, particularly against cavalry, if they're facing them. I would also be tempted to give them some sort of charging bonus as well. When the Grenadier à Cheval charged, they really smashed home. Now, I'm not sure that they should necessarily have the 9 dice that they have in Black Powder for their hand-to-hand combat. Maybe dropping it to 8, but giving them
a rule similar to the British cavalry, which I think is called Devastating Charge, something like that. Furious Charge, I think it is. Furious Charge, which means they re-roll all their fails to hit on the charge. I think something like that would be a much better representation of the Grenadier Cheval and the power of their charges than just giving them extra dice. But, either way, I don't think one is particularly good or particularly terrible. I think they both work. And, I wouldn't necessarily say, oh yeah, this definitely needs changing. I think they work fine as they are. Like I said earlier on in the video, I'd also be tempted to have maybe a large regiment with a portion of them being made up of the Gendarme delete models, just to symbolise them being part of the same formation. I think the Gendarmes are probably too small to operate on their own, so something like that I think would really help them. So, that's it for the Cavalry of the Guard, the Heavy Cavalry of the Guard. It has been such a long video, I've split it into two, so thank you very much for watching this far. It's a formation that, for me, is very evocative of the period, and, as I said in my favourite regiments video, it's one that symbolises the Napoleonic era for me. So, we've only got one video left in this series. I know it's the one that everyone's been looking forward to, the Old Guard Infantry. So, if you enjoyed this video and that's something that you think you might want to listen to, please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you know that when the video drops. All it remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening. See you next time. Goodbye.